So we'll just introduce ourselves again real quick. So my name is Mormoris. I am currently at the University of Birmingham. I'm the Equality and Diversity Officer for students there.
And I'm Zainab. I was at UWE, where I met and worked with Alex, but as of 3 days ago, joined London Met, and I'm the Associate Pro Vice Chancellor for Attainment, Equity and Inclusion.
Unfortunately, we're going to be speaking fairly quickly. I've mistaken this one for an hour slot, so we're going to bring it down to 20 minutes at lightning speed, and it'll be quite impressive, hopefully. The aim of our presentation today is basically to talk about the experience of putting together equity. So we're going to talk a little bit about what it was, but we're also going to try and make sense of everything which happened through the use of critical race theory. Can I just have a show of hands who's familiar with CRT? Brilliant, we can kind of just skirt through that one then, okay. So the overview for the presentation is basically we're going to just talk about some of the tenets of critical race theory which are going to be used and to basically explain and kind of make sense of what happened through the equity programme. We're going to talk about equity, the history of it, and the rationale of why it got started and where it led us to. Then we're going to look at equity through, we're going to merge those two sections and look at equity through the lens of CRT. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the pedagogy which it left us with for the equity programme. So the points of CRT which we're using, the 5 tenets which we're going to be looking at, is basically that racism is the norm, so it is not an abnormal thing, it is not out of the ordinary. Racism is the norm, it is how we kind of do business and things work. Interest convergence as well, so we're going to be looking at the idea that in terms of race equality, to take a step forward, that the interests of both minoritised and non-minoritised people have to be in alliance. Race is a social construct as well, so there is no kind of biological basis for racism. We're also going to be talking a little bit about intersectionality and also the importance of the unique voice of colour and storytelling as a methodology within this as well.
We just speak a little bit about why we're going to tell you our personal story and the students' experience through equity. Grounded in CRT, you'll remember that storytelling has, over the course of the last 20, 30 years, really galvanised around the critical evaluation of what happens to minoritised individuals through the academy, and storytelling has repeatedly come up by scholars who justify it as an approach. So Ladston-Billings talks about storytelling as being beneficial for academics of colour in the academy as a form of healing. So part of our 15-20 minutes with you is a form of healing ourselves in terms of the experiences that we went through in developing equity. And in addition to the benefits that it affords academics of colour, it's also for the storytelling can also be for the benefit of white colleagues in the academy in terms of developing a better understanding of the nuanced forms of racism which operate within the walls of campus. And let us not forget that storytelling has throughout time been a prevalent form of creating or constructing racial norms and tropes.
Thank you. Also as well, just to add that there have been a lot of reports published, mostly around the attainment gap. We're going to be looking at employability. But what can often be left out and fairly sanitised within those is the lived experience of putting together one of these reports. This is something which can only really be gathered and communicated through a narrative description of what that was like. So we'll talk a little bit about the background and context for equity.
Okay, so very quickly, you'll be familiar with the student pipeline in terms of what's happening to our students as they go through the university experience. We know that on the whole it's not an issue in terms of getting access to post-92 institutions. We're seeing higher numbers of ethnic minority students heading towards higher education. The challenge is what happens to them once they complete and then go into the world of work. Over the course of the last couple of years, several high-profile publications that have reiterated that performance disparities start the moment students of colour go into the world of work, both in terms of the quality of employment, so lower levels of professional level employment are secured. Also, if you are a black graduate, you're twice as likely to be unemployed as their white counterparts. The race pay gap also appears on entry to the labour market. And the race pay gap widens with qualifications. So 2 16-year-olds, one black, one white, would expect to have a race pay gap of somewhere around 11%. After university and after all of that additional economic personal investment, the race pay gap widens to 23%. So we started with the graduate outcomes part of the student journey, and we're very mindful that sometimes when people will talk about equity, so people as in not us, they might confuse it as some sort of attempt to close the awarding gap, and we're very clear about this. Equity does not touch the awarding gap. We're only focusing on labour market outcomes. And we also were mindful and deliberate in that choice because we knew that in terms of securing institutional buy-in, quite frankly, it was easier for us to start with graduate outcomes as opposed to tackling the awarding gap, because essentially equity is a bolt-on rather than embedded throughout the institution.
Just a quick point as well in terms of the terminology which we're going to be using throughout. So we have kept in the term BME or BAME. Partly this is because of shared understanding of that term in the groups which we're talking about. Personally, we kind of, well, I'll speak for myself, but prefer to use either global majority when we're talking about a situation which includes international students or minoritized individuals if we're talking specifically about home students as well. Just to note as well that this was targeted at home students as well, mostly because of the funding stream which it came through, which was the Access Agreement. In terms of our own personal circumstances when we stepped onto the programme, so equity was kind of developed within 6 months in total, I think. So previous to it, I was working for the Health and Applied Sciences faculty, which was a different faculty. Equity took place within the Faculty of Business and Law, so there was a very specific kind of niche student demographic which we were looking at there. My previous experience in Health and Applied Sciences was as the BME officer for the faculty, which I learned after about a kind of year in the role was quite a tokenistic endeavour. It was kind of off the back of the Race Equality Charter Mark. The Dean for that faculty had been tasked with getting the Charter Mark, and a bit of a backlash to kind of not having made as much progress as the institution had hoped, mostly because they weren't listening to the stories of minoritized people, was this role to come out. It happened, the role was placed at such a level where there wasn't much influence over larger senior decisions, so it was kind of like, we have this role to take on a lot of different things, but we don't have the funding, the support, or the institutional buy-in to actually make this happen. At my interview, one of the people interviewing me said, Alex, we want to see a change, but we don't know what change looks like. And for me, I was kind of like, great, blank slate, we can kind of just do what we like and then like really experiment with this. But it underlined a position that there wasn't even enough engagement with the topic to understand what needed to be done.
In terms of where I was when we started this, I had an academic leadership role within the Faculty of Business and Law, and I was also part of what was then the self-assessment team for the institution's Race Equality Charter Mark, and I just fallen out with the REC chair, and so as a gesture to placate me, the institution gave me some money, which then allowed us to hire Alex into the faculty and actually then go off and develop equity.
Also, just on Global Majority, so I changed my job title to Global Majority Project Officer, and then when they got rid of me, they changed it back, which I thought was quite interesting in terms of the terms which we use. On to what actually we produced through equity and what the programme looked like. Okay,
so very quickly, we conducted an extensive consultation exercise with students, with our external networks, and we've got UWE is based in Bristol, which is quite a small city. And so our ability to tap into key networks of minoritized professionals, entrepreneurs is actually probably easier than it would be in a much larger city. And also there was a complete dearth of this type of activity going on in the city. So we found that we were pushing on open doors in terms of getting people's participation and contribution to what was needed in order to support our students, increase their navigational capital as they then embark on their careers. We also spoke with academics. We were quite selective in terms of who we decided to speak with. To be fair, we centred mostly on individuals from minority backgrounds, and the result is a 4-pillar programme, which is best understood as one of your leadership programmes that any of us might go on during the course of our own careers. So the 4 pillars are one-to-one mentoring. So students are paired up with an external mentor of their choosing. They might be a white ally, or they could be a minority from a certain sector or industry, and they then have 4 1-hour mentoring sessions per academic year. The second limb, which was quite innovative in terms of it being introduced into a university setting, identity and leadership coaching. So traditional leadership coaching tends to focus on goal setting and identifying what your own personal and professional values might be and how you align your values to your chosen career pathways. But we also introduced an aspect of racial identity to that. So an external coach came in to talk to students about the realities of living in a racist context, how to deal with microaggressions, and also how we shed some of the connotations which sometimes can harbour shame and negative attributes, which are all social constructions of racism. Third pillar, enterprise workshops, all delivered by external facilitators, all minority facilitators, those graduate attributes which no one ever tells you about, so how to network effectively, how to advocate for yourself if you're working in a freelance context, how to negotiate a contract and protect your bottom line. So not your standard careers workshops, but that sort of additional layer. And the fourth pillar were large networking events. So again, the Bristol context is important here. We were able to get about 150 to 300 people each month to come and network with our students. And in each evening event there would be exhibitors from other local specialist provision, so mental health charities that were working in minority communities, sexual health provision, and then we also had large guest lectures, and we tried to get really big names in, so Akala, Lamy, Applehurst, they were coming in on a monthly basis. And in total we've had about 35 events so far over the course of 3 years.
Okay, so CRT's impression or understanding the process of putting equity together and then what it is. So if we start with racism as the norm, if we take on this tenant and really think about what this would mean for the programme, first of all, as this was a positive action programme which looked to target specific individuals, we should expect some level of resistance to that from the institution if we're under the impression that racism is the norm. What we found, that was the case, but in addition, that surprisingly it felt like everyone was sort of reading from the same script in a certain way. And it was not just at kind of a senior level, but all throughout the institution. So we've got a few case studies. If you wanted to talk about the passports first.
Okay, right, so a number of our evening events were catered. And so we decided to use external catering, and I'm sure anyone in the room who's ever tried to do that on university premises will understand the paperwork and the bureaucratic nightmare that we would have had to have gone through. The caterers were all minority run businesses. One caterer in particular, who is a local businessman, has very long dreadlocks, and he was asked by our colleagues in facilities to show his passport before he was able to sort of set up on the day. He passed all the other due diligence required, but he and all of his staff were actually asked to show their passports.
Yeah, and this is someone who, at the time, I think had 3 restaurants within the city as well. So it wasn't kind of, not that this would be an excuse, but this is a very well-established member of the business and the catering community within the city as well.
Yeah, and the comments were, we were in his defence saying, he's got an established chain of restaurants, and oh no, is it just a shack in a particular part of Bristol called St Paul's, which is a largely black neighbourhood, so trying to debase the credibility of him as a supplier.
This happens, so this interaction would be with someone who is at kind of like a mid-management level within kind of like the sort of events team, was it? Yeah. This other interaction, which was around the reputation of the event. So this happened with someone who was kind of lower down on the hierarchy, and this happened when I was returning some walkie-talkies which were used to help manage one of the events. I went to the office to hand back the walkie-talkies, and someone mentioned, oh, that was the event yesterday. I heard there was a lot of rubbish at the event. There was no rubbish after the event. This was only the day after we'd had the event, but there'd still been kind of like this level of communication where they felt the need to kind of tell me that, our event had been incredibly messy. And this was a frontline member of staff who was supposed to be in charge of kind of just checking things in, but this is how far the impression of the events had trickled through the system.
And this is off the back of an event that we piloted in 2016, where I'd been given permission by the Dean of the Faculty in the building that the event was taking place in to bring on-site caterers and different suppliers, but that hadn't trickled through to the relevant part of facilities. So somebody from facilities turned up with a clipboard on the night and was demanding to speak to the member of staff involved. And I kept representing myself as a member of staff in charge of the event, and they wanted to speak to somebody more senior, and that was me on the night. And on that, 5 minutes left, okay.
Yeah.
And in relation to the walkie-talkie incident, do you remember, Alex, that the night before, when we were locking up at about 11 o'clock at night, we said to each other, should we take some photographs as proof that we left the premises in a clean condition?
Yeah, because this is a well-worn trope which has kind of happened with other events as well. We're going to speed up. So, race as a social construct. This is, I'm still trying to work through how to best articulate this, but basically, even when we were working with individuals who this really feeded in and enhanced their own portfolio, so we were working with widening participation teams who this is fantastic for them. It's a really clear thing which they can put on their access participation plan. We still had a level of resistance. They are people who are generally well versed, come to conferences like this, understand elements of race equality, but there was still this level of resistance. And my theory is that this kind of comes from an embedded sort of deficit model in terms of how they view and understand this program. So because, and this is linked to race being a social construct, so if we understand BME individuals and students as inherently needing some sort of change through the deficit lens, so if we say that they come to university and the reason why they're not performing is because of some innate deficit, then a program which looks to enhance and help them to navigate certain aspects of our culture, of our society, and also looks to emphasise some of the skills which they already bring into the classroom does not make sense. And this was part of the reason I feel that we were met with a lot of resistance in terms of the evaluation of the programme and being constantly sort of monitored from that kind of aspect as well.
Okay, so there's so much to say. Well, we had an hour, this is why we're like, what on earth? So obviously deficit model doesn't just apply to students for that fixed period of time. It continues for anyone who's from a marginalised or minority background in this particular context will stay with us for the entirety of our lives. So, and it very much applies to those of us who are leading the programme. So it was majority led by individuals who are from a minority background. And so if we think about concepts of whiteness and who is ascribed authority to act and permission to act and credible in this space, all of that was constantly being challenged as we were working our way through. Alex has just mentioned monitoring and evaluation. Really perfect example there of where our credibility was constantly chipped away at because we were being routinely asked to create and meet ever demanding and complicated monitoring and evaluation matrices, which wasn't asked of any other widening participation initiative in the institution. This is despite the fact that we were winning national awards, including the Guardian University Award, during the course of the programme's rollout. In the first year, so equity and all of those 4 limbs are all voluntary. Students don't have to go to it. They can subscribe to whichever bit they fancy. In the first year, 150 students took part, and in the second year, 320 students took part. Because we're running out of time, I'm just going to jump ahead.
Yeah, go for it.
Because I wanted to make a point about this business about impact. So various voices in the institution were constantly saying, well, we're not sure equity is having any impact. That was, again, a slight on our ability to actually dictate or determine which direction of travel we wanted to go in. And if you think about the NSS, and I'm sure everyone in the room is familiar with it, depending on which institution you're in, it could be either super important or marginally important, but it's on everyone's radar. The NSS is student voice evaluation. Now, with every event and every activity we ran, we captured the student voice. Alex, when he was with us, had quite an elaborate set of focus groups, which then continued and expanded into the second year. So we were constantly capturing the student voice, which was overwhelmingly positive. If we had more time, we would give you some of the quotes that the students were saying. But because that was predominantly a black student voice, that in itself was not enough. And yet so much weight is placed on student voice through the NSS.
Interest convergence. So that's essentially why this program was allowed to continue as well. It was more successful than I think, I'm going to say it, than I thought it was going to be, definitely, in terms of the national awards and the local awards. And this is kind of also part of the thing which put the limitations on the program as well. So we could only work up to the point where the interests remained converged, which led to kind of like some quite uncomfortable compromises in certain aspects as well, which if we had the time we would go into. Intersectionality as well. Do you want to talk about?
No, go for it.
Okay, cool. So intersectionality, this really gave us an understanding in terms of where we may hold certain privileges and where we don't, and also in terms of the range of speakers which we would also include in the program as well. I'm not going to dwell on that too much, I don't think. In terms of the progressive pedagogy, so this is where we kind of flip CRT and kind of recognise where, when we stick to those points and principles, it inevitably leads more to a more progressive pedagogy. I wouldn't go as far as to say a radical pedagogy because of the need for interest convergence. So in terms of voices of colour, putting that at the forefront in terms of the programmes which we put forward meant that this was incredibly relevant to the students who came along and who were targeted. The levels of intersectionality as well helped to build on that point. Respecting that racism is the norm meant that we weren't teaching or giving generic information to BME students or students of colour. We were telling them stuff which would be radically useful to them in terms of when they go out into the jobs market, and this is coming from people who had achieved some level of success within it. In terms of the limits of interest convergence as well, we then understood kind of like that it was important to have the photos to put in for the awards in order to kind of cover ourselves, but that this would ultimately lead to some limitations in terms of what we could and couldn't do in terms of equity. That's our time. Thank you for listening.